Hello everyone, JC Jester here, and I hope that you guys sit back and enjoy this tutorial on how to make the cosplay of Susie from Dead by Daylight. This will be a beginner level tutorial including some foam work, some basic sewing, and some weathering techniques. Materials needed for the outfit are as follows. You'll need some fabric of your choice. I used a kind of fleece here. A matching rib trim. This will be used to finish off the sleeves and the waist. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to get the color I wanted for the hoodie. It's supposed to be a dark blue, so here I have two dyes to correct the color. For the skirt, you can use a red or green tartan fabric. For the tools, you'll need some tailor's chalk. This will be used to transfer your paper pattern onto the fabric. You'll need a pair of sharp fabric scissors to cut your fabric, a measuring tape to check your measurements, and of course lots of pins. For the pattern of your hoodie, there are several different ways you can do this. You can either buy a pattern from the store, you can draft your own pattern, but I am going to use the easiest method for beginners. We are going to create a pattern from a hoodie that already exists. So take a hoodie that fits you well and fold it the way you see I'm doing in the video. Now you can see the basic shape of the hoodie. You just need to trace around it onto a piece of paper. Be sure to stretch out the rib trim at the bottom to get an accurate size and shape. I had already gone ahead and done this, so here is the paper pattern that I have. As you can see, the pattern is a little bit bigger than the hoodie. This is because my hoodie is a little bit of a snug fit and I wanted it to be baggier. So I made adjustments to the length and the width of the pattern piece. As you can see, my pattern piece is only a quarter of the jacket. This is because the front and back pieces are very similar, and when I cut the fabric, I'll be cutting on the fold. Also, be sure to include a seam allowance for your sewing. A seam allowance is usually around 1 to 2 centimeters in width. Then I did the exact same thing for the sleeves and the hood. So here you can see the sleeve is also a little bit wider than the original, as the hood will be baggier and light finished product. I also made sure to strip out the rib trim before transferring. The hood part on this jacket here is actually very tight and very small, which is why on my pattern piece you can see it is much bigger. However, if you're working with a hoodie that fits you very well, you don't have to make any of those adjustments that I am making here. Once you have your 3 pattern pieces, it is time to check if your pattern piece will actually fit together nicely. This is an easy method that you can use to check if your pattern pieces are the right size. So take your sleeve piece and place it against the start of your seam allowance. So then just use your hands to carefully guide the pattern piece along the edge of the seam. See how the position of the seam allowance match? This is how you will know that your pattern piece is the right size. However, if you're not sure about the fitting of your pattern, you can always make it better. You need to do the same thing for the hood to double check that it will fit onto your jacket properly. Remember when I said the pattern piece for the front and the back were very similar? This is what I meant. Since the front neckline is a lot lower than the back neckline, I just simply folded it in like this, and that will be the pattern for the front, and that's the pattern for the back. Simple as that. Then of course check the length of your hoodie to see if it will fit onto your jacket. Remember to check both the front and the back. Now that your pattern pieces are ready, lay your fabric out on the flat area, then trace around using a tailor's chalk before cutting it. Pin together the shoulder and the sides, pin together the sleeves individually, and pin together the hood. I sewed this together using my sewing machine, but you can do this by hand as well. Once all the sides that you previously pinned are sewn, you can then attach the sleeves to the body and the hood to the body. Of course, as you're sewing, you need to remove the pins and make sure that your sewing machine's needle doesn't hit the pins, otherwise the needle might break. And of course, make sure that your pins are packed away safely as you remove them, especially if you have little children or pets in the household. And once everything is sewn together, you can now do a test fit to see if you like the sizing. It was also at this point that I noticed that I was missing the front pocket, and so I added it in quickly. Now we do the rib trim of the sleeve and the waistline. The length of your rib trim is the same size as the circumference of your wrist and your waist plus 1 or 2 centimeters leeway, and of course, add in your seam allowance. When attaching it, make sure that you stretch out your rib trim as you're pinning it onto the sleeve. You need to stretch it out because your rib trim is actually a little bit smaller than the end of your sleeve. This way, when you finish attaching the rib trim onto your sleeve, it will give it that gathered look. The type of stitch I use to attach the rib trim onto the sleeve is a zigzag stitch. Then of course I did the same thing for the waist. Once I finished making my hoodie, I moved on to the dyeing process. Each kind of dye is different, so just make sure that you follow the instructions as shown on the packaging. My dye required me to work with hot water, so I was really careful when working with it. Also, I made sure to wear gloves so that it didn't stain my hands as much. Here you can see how I just take my fabric and I just dunk it into this tiny little pot and giving it an uneven distribution of the dye. This is because I wanted the hoodie to look really discolored and washed out. So make sure that you submerge your fabric evenly if you want an even dye job. I also tried to pour the dye onto the jacket. Here's a comparison of before and after the dye job. I really like the discolored and patchy look I achieved. But I still wanted to make it look more worn and weathered. So I made a mixture of black acrylic ink, some navy fabric paint, and then diluted it with a lot of water until it was nice and watery to work with. I used this mixture on all the seams and all the areas that I thought that would be the most dirtied up. An easy technique to use to try achieve the splattered look is to dip your paintbrush into the watery mixture, then simply flick your paintbrush. This then creates really randomized looking splashes. The fake blood, I mixed in some red acrylic paint and a tiny bit of yellow into the previous mixture. Here in this video I have already added some of the blood effects, and now I'm just simply building up the opacity and highlighting certain areas. When you weather things, you always want to build up the color gradually. This will give you more control on how your finished product will look. Because despite the fact that I want the blood spatters to look really natural, I didn't want it to look like an absolute mess, so I did want to control how it looked in some way at least. Another reason why you have to work in very light layers when doing weathering on fabric in particular is because that fabric looks a little bit different when it is wet. The color will appear a little bit darker, so you don't really know what the true color of your fabric is. So give it some time, let your fabric dry in between each layer of weathering that you add on. Because you can always add more color, but you can't take away any paint that's on fabric. Once the paint for the fake blood has dried, I took some thick string and a big needle and did the fake stitching. And of course these stitches are purely decorative, as the pocket is stitched on properly with the machine stitch. Once the stitches were done, your hoodie is 100% complete. Before we move on to your skirt, I'd like to apologize that I had lost some of the footage of making the skirt. But luckily, pleated skirts are really easy to make, so you can just Google on how to make a knife pleat skirt. Once you have your skirt, it is time to rough up the edges. Use your scissors to cut away at some parts of the hem, and use your hands to try and get some tears in there as well if you can. Another thing you can try do to make it look more frayed is to use a craft knife and cut away at the edges. This next step has two purposes. One purpose is to make it look a bit more weathered and dirtied up, and the other purpose is to make sure that the fraying doesn't continue. Because whilst you want your skirt to look really damaged, you don't really actually want your skirt to be constantly fraying and leaving small little threads all over the place. So the thing that I am painting onto the damaged edges is a mixture of fabric glue and that acrylic ink. The fabric glue will hold together the rough edges and make sure the fabric doesn't fray any further in future. The same thing for the skirt as I did for the hoodie, making some really random dirt marks on it. The first step of making this mask is of course to acquire a pattern. The pattern I used here will be available for download for free on my Ko-fi website, which will be linked down below. Once you have your pattern, you cut it out and you trace it onto some foam. I used a high density 5mm foam for this. I transferred the pattern onto the foam with a white marker, and I made sure to include all of the dots, and also made sure to mark each of the seams with A, B or C as according to the pattern. Then using an X-Acto knife or a craft knife, cut out the pattern. Make sure that your knife is perpendicular to the surface that you're working with to get a clean cut, and making sure that your pattern will fit together nicely without any issues. I also used the bottom of my empty mug to sharpen my craft knife. This is to make sure that the craft knife is nice and sharp with every cut and is not pulling against the foam, making a rough surface. Now that everything is cut out, I used contact adhesive to stick everything together. First starting with the dots of each individual piece, I glued those together first, then I glued the bigger pieces together. The reason why I put my contact adhesive in this little squeezy bottle is because it makes application a lot easier, as you can use the nozzle to just spread the glue over the seam. This also stops your big tin of contact adhesive from drying out as you're working with it. It is very important to be patient while working with contact adhesive, as you need to wait for it to be a little bit tacky before you can glue the two pieces together. When you glue them together, make sure that you line up the seams perfectly. The way you can check if you're gluing it together correctly is by seeing if you're lining up the dots correctly. Once all of the pieces are stuck together, use your heat gun to shape your mask. The heat from the heat gun will allow the foam to become a little bit malleable, and you'll be able to shape it. Hold it in the shape that you want it to have, and as it cools down, it will retain that shape. The heat gun will also help seal the surface of the foam, which will make priming a lot easier, giving you a smoother finish when you're done with priming. I didn't want my mask to be perfectly smooth since it's from a horror game, so I added a little bit more texture onto the surface of the foam. As you can see here, it's kind of got a leathery, kind of rough texture on certain spots. This adds a really nice organic look to it. The way I created this texture was very simple. I first heated up the surface of the foam, then I took a ball of tin foil and pressed it into the foam. This creates the indentations and makes this really beautiful texture to work with. Now we move on to priming. The reason why we prime the foam is to prepare the foam surface for the next step, which will be painting. The primer I'll be using is going to be a mixture of glue, water, and a bit of acrylic paint. The ratio for these three things will be around about 30% water, 65% glue, and 5% acrylic paint. Now, the reason why we use this glue is that firstly of all, it is easy to get, and it is very easy to use. The glue will create a nice smooth surface, a hard shell on the foam, which prevents the foam from absorbing all of the paint later. And we mix it with a little bit of water because wood glue by itself is way too thick to spread. It is going to leave a horrible amount of brush strokes when you paint it on. Then the acrylic paint is to add a bit more flexibility into the primer. Wood glue by itself is going to crack when it's dried. So if you finish with your mask and then you end up accidentally bending it, it's going to crack and the surface is going to look horrible. The acrylic paint will add a bit more flexibility to that, so it's much less likely to crack. Finally, the reason why I mix everything into this bottle is because you're going to need several layers of primer. Around about 6 layers is good. And instead of mixing 6 really small batches and wasting a lot of glue and product, so instead mix one big batch in a bottle and I'm able to use it over a much longer period of time. Now that my primer is finally mixed up, I'll be applying the first layer of primer. As you can see, I'll be spreading it with a paintbrush, and this is what the consistency should be like more or less. Not too thick, but also not too thin to run. If you want a very smooth and clean finished product, you should work in very small layers, as this creates very little texture in the primer. But since I do want some texture in my finished product, that is why I'm working in slightly thicker layers in certain areas. The technique where I am dabbing on the primer is also to create more texture, as it is creating an uneven layer of the primer. Once the first layer of priming is done, you should leave your mask out to dry completely before applying the next layer. You would need around about 4 to 6 layers of primer in total. Don't forget to wash your paintbrush thoroughly with some clean water after every layer of primer, and also to clean the nozzle and the cap of your bottle. Otherwise, when you close it, the glue is going to stick it together and you won't be able to use it again. Take care of your stuff. Once all 6 layers of my primer was done, I added a little bit more extra detailing using some gesso. I layered some thick layers of gesso along the cracks and the seams, and I also used a bit of gesso to fill in the gaps. This texture makes it really organic and adds a bit more of a horror element, I think. Then I finished it off once more with some Rust-Oleum 2x primer. This is an optional step, it just makes that finish a lot nicer. Once I was finished with my Rust-Oleum spray, I did my base coat. To do this base coat, I mixed out a off-white color with acrylic paint. The mixture is yellow, red, and a tiny bit of blue with a lot of white. And as you can see, I don't really apply this with much care. It's uneven, it's patchy. This is because that's the kind of effect I want. The discolored, uneven sort of look. Once my beige base coat was dried, I added a layer of pure white acrylic on top of it. The uneven layers and the missing spots in certain areas made the paint look old and washed out. If you don't want this splotchy paint and the rough texture, you can be a bit more careful with your primer and your paints. Moving on to the first bit of detailing work, mix out a greenish brown and use that color to dab in and around the crack of the mask. With the same green, mark out where you want the little studs to be. Mark out where your lines are going to be. Once you're happy with how everything looks, darken all your markings and all the detailings with darker brown. Using hot glue or super glue, glue on the little studs. I will show you how I did the colourful paint splashes in a moment. The lines from earlier was to help us plan out where the wire will go. Those little studs are quite easy to make. I made mine out of polymer clay. They are just 2 little rounded rectangles stuck together. You can make yours out of EVA foam or air dry clay if you don't have polymer clay. Then you can just prime and paint them. Then to make the wire, we just need some acrylic paint, some string or some twine, and it's quite easy. Paintbrush and apply a generous amount of acrylic paint onto the string, making sure that you cover every single side of it. I had pre-cut my string because I had already estimated more or less how much of the wiring I would need for the mask. Another note is that when I stuck on the wire, I only placed glue around the studs. Onto my personal favourite part of doing this mask, it was adding all the blood. To do the first bit of blood, I mixed a watery mixture of red and a little bit of black with a tiny bit of blue. This will be the dried blood, and this method here is very similar to how I did the colourful splotches. Add a tiny amount of the watery paint onto the mask, then use your finger to dab it and spread it. When doing any kind of weathering, whether it is making something look aged or adding blood, work in small amounts and work in layers. This gives the item a bit more dimension and also makes it look a bit more natural. Working in small amounts also gives you a bit more control, and then you're able to manipulate how you want something to look. Because you can always make something darker if you've made it too light, however, if you made something too dark, it is very difficult to make it lighter again. When adding the fake blood, make sure that you try to make it a bit more random, not too uniform so it looks natural. Then to do the fresh blood effect, I used acrylic glaze medium and some red alcohol ink. The reason why I use these two things is that both are translucent. The acrylic glaze medium that I used is the glossy kind, so when it dries it still has a shiny look, which provides the wet look of the fresh blood that I wanted. To actually do the effect, I waited for the mixture to dry slightly. This way when I added a large blob, instead of running down really quickly, it dripped down slowly while drying, giving us that running droplet effect when it's fully dried. I also used the back of the paintbrush to simply dab around and flick about the brush to give it that splattered look as well. If it gets too dry, you can simply add a little drop of alcohol ink again. The mixture might dry out quite quickly since the alcohol evaporates very fast. You can also see me occasionally tapping the bottom of the mask to allow the droplet to drip a bit faster. But however, you don't want it to drop too quickly, otherwise it's not going to be able to dry while it drips down. As final detailing, I used silver acrylic paint and put 4 dots on it. This is because on some of the artwork, it looks like those little studs are actually the things you have on braces, but obviously this is too big to be realistically braces, and I still thought it looked kinda cool and added the details anyways. Here's what the completed mask looks like with all the details. As you can see, even though the blood is completely dry, it still retains that wet glossy look. To finish off our mask, we'll need some elastic, 2 small pieces of thin EVA foam, and a piece of see-through fabric. Take your mask and take the fabric and estimate how much of it you will need. I added this so that we can have a blacked out look from the outside, but still kind of see-through, even though you can't really see through this mask and your vision kinda sucks, but hey, having 1% vision is better than having none at all. Then using a hot glue gun, I placed glue around the edges of the gaps. Be really careful when you're using hot glue as it can burn you really badly. I placed the fabric over the glue, then used the back of my scissors to tap down the fabric and adhere it to the mask. This is to prevent myself from burning my fingers. Then I trimmed off any excess fabric and repeated it for the other side. It looks like a solid black from the outside, but if you were to wear this mask, you can still see through the gaps. To measure out where you want to put the elastic, just simply mark out where your temple will be if you were to put on the mask. The length of your elastic should be from temple to temple, going from the back of your head and a little bit less. Using hot glue, I placed a generous amount of it onto one end and placed the elastic on. Once that was dried and secured, I stuck on the other side, making sure that when I stuck it on, the elastic was not twisted. Once that was done, I placed a bit of contact adhesive over the elastic and onto the small piece of EVA foam. When both pieces were tacky, I stuck the pieces together. This makes sure that the elastic is on the mask really strongly and it wouldn't come off if you were to pull on it. The reason why I use 2 elastics instead of 1 is because if you wear it like this, it wouldn't move around a lot. And say hi to my cat. Next up is the ruler. This prop is also con-safe since it is made out of EVA foam and some warbler. The construction for it is fairly easy since the pattern is only just a few rectangles. Start off with your rectangle strip of your desired length. Using your craft knife at a 45-degree angle, trim away the 2 sides. Now glue 2 similar rectangles onto the angled edge. The sides facing down are also trimmed away at a 45-degree angle. This is so when you glue the bottom on, it will lay flat. For the shape of the bottom piece, I just took the whole thing and traced it out onto a piece of EVA foam. Same thing for the side, then cut a jagged edge into the sharp end. Primed with 6 layers of the primer like I did with the mask. For the paint, I mixed out a natural looking brown and similar looking shades. When painting, make sure that your brush strokes are up and down the ruler only. Apply each layer unevenly, using each of the different shades of brown, and this will create the natural looking wood grain. Once I had a decent coverage, I then took a hard bristled brush and started using that. This creates a more defined wood grain look. Once the first coat of the paint was done, I mixed in some white into the browns, which I then used to paint in the splintered parts of the broken ruler. This made it seem a little bit more realistic as the broken parts wouldn't have any wood stain in it. Then I also dry brushed on some of that lighter color onto the rest of the ruler with my hard bristle brush. Making sure to not press the brush too hard and leaving light strokes and lines behind. Once this was dry, I used my hard brush again to fill in any places where there wasn't enough paint. Also, this was the pen that I used to draw on the lines and write the numbers. For the nails, I used warbler scraps. I heated it up and rolled them into noodles. If you don't have any warbler on hand, you can also do this out of clay. You can also use kebab sticks if you sand away the sharp tip. Whatever you use, just make sure that it isn't sharp enough to hurt anyone. Here is what the completed nails look like. All of them are slightly different. Some are longer, some are shorter, some are thinner, and some are bent. Then I just painted them with some acrylic paint, and then moved on to gluing them onto the ruler. Don't glue them on too quickly, as you want to fiddle around with the positioning and try see what looks nice. And once you have a plan, you can start gluing each nail on with some hot glue. Once the glue has cooled down, you can start fiddling around with the tape. Try wrap it in a way that it goes around each of the nails. I use masking tape, but the other option is duct tape. Once I was happy with the positioning of my tape, I used my fingers to scrunch up and crinkle some areas. Then I used the same mixture as before to do the fake blood, focusing on the nails and by where the ruler is broken. And here is what the blood looks like when it's dry. Hey guys, Jessie here. Thank you guys so much for watching till the end, and if you guys saw that this tutorial was really helpful and useful, I'd really appreciate it if you gave me a like and follow. And if you have any other questions, you guys can pop me a DM on Instagram. And until next time.